So we ended last time talking about the Oregon Territory and how James K. Polk, by the time he was done in office, had expanded the United States all the way to the west coast of the all the way to the west coast of the U.S., essentially achieving his goal and the goal of the country of manifest destiny. You know, that God-given idea that America is like ordained by God to expand all the way to the western portion of the United States. The question is, now that we have these new territories, all this area in the middle of the country is like Oklahoma and Kansas and the Dakotas in here. You have this new land that is gained from Mexico. You have this new land that is gained from Britain, that is modern day like California, California, Utah, Arizona, Oregon, Washington, stuff like that. The question is, how do we start bringing those areas into the country? At this point, they're just territories. They stuff we own, but they're not states. The question is, what happens when these places want to become states? And the first place that sort of really begins to ask that question is the state you all currently live in, and all of us are in right now, is the state of California. Now, remember beforehand, California had had a few folks find their way out to the northern portion of California in like the late 1830s into the 1840s, following the California Trail, which is kind of a spur off of the longer Oregon Trail. Um, but there were not a lot of folks. There were a few folks in Southern California that had moved in down here, kind of, in modern day Los Angeles, San Diego, stuff like that, Santa Barbara, when Spain owned it, and then eventually when it became independent and a part of Mexico. But California was still fairly sparsely populated. There were not many people living in California at the time. However, that all changes in 1848 when gold is discovered at Sutter's Mill up here in Northern California on the banks of the American River. And it kicks off what is, probably you've learned about this several times in school as the California Gold Rush. Um, it happens in late 1848, but word makes its way back to the East Coast at the end of that year and early in the following year. And in 1849, you see this big rush of people being like, oh my gosh, I can make money by going to California and working in the gold mines. And so, even though the gold was discovered in 1848, it is in 1849 when everybody starts moving west into California. In that year alone, over 80,000 people come westward to California. Most of them actually don't come overland. Most of them end up taking ships around like South America because that's actually a faster route. And they end up all coming to California, many of them settling in the San Francisco Bay Area, because that's sort of a major port at that point where a lot of the steamships will make it to. And what this does is within a span of about 1 year, just a little over a year, between 1848 and 1850, you see California's population grows big enough to that they have enough people to meet the requirements to apply for statehood. I want to say it's you have to have like about 100,000 or so. And they had maybe 20, 30,000 before then, but in 1 year they see that population balloon. And so at this point they're like, wow, we have enough people because of all of these 49ers, these gold prospectors who were coming out from the East Coast to try and make their money. Not all of them ended up working in the mines. Many people, well, excuse me, many people just ended up settling in like San Francisco and providing services for those miners, hotels, bars, restaurants, dry goods stores, equipment, stuff like that. And so this big industry pops up around sort of gold mining and the people that are coming over here. Not a lot of people actually made their money off of gold. A lot of people made their money off of selling things to the gold prospectors. But by 1850, you see that California has enough people and applies for statehood. The problem is we've had this manifest destiny, we'll expand west. Now all the land is ours. But the real question is now that the land is ours, what are we going to do with it? And that old issue of slavery pops its head up again in all of these new Western lands that are currently unoccupied, unorganized, that aren't part of an official government yet. And the question is, how do we deal with slavery in these new lands? Um, and especially in California, because California is literally knocking on the door saying, we would like to become a state now. We've met all the requirements. And Congress is like, oh crap, what do we do? And so a lot of the problem is that much of this new area is south of that Missouri Compromise line. I'm going to go back a bunch of slides here. Remember, we had, where'd it go? Well, this is fine. That Missouri Compromise um, set a line right here at the 38th parallel, basically at the bottom of Missouri in 1820 and 1821, that said areas below this land would allow slavery. Areas above this land would not allow slavery in any of the unorganized territories. But now we have all of this territory as well. And so, with a lot of this new land being south of that Missouri Compromise, including where we currently are today, Southern California, in California, basically split right along that line, what do we do with all of these new territories? Let's go back to where we were. Um, So what do we do with this? And so there's lots of options. A senator whose last name is Wilmot puts forward this bill several times in Congress called the Wilmot Proviso that tried to ban slavery forever in any new territory acquired from Mexico. That would be a lot of that land would be south of the Missouri Compromise. That would be California, Arizona, New Mexico, things like that. It was proposed three times in a span of 3 years, but it never passed. It died each time. They kept trying to get it through, but it never got done. Instead, what a lot of people proposed is a term that will definitely come up in our next class period, is this idea of popular sovereignty, that the residents of that territory should have the right to vote for or against slavery on their own, not to have that condition be set by legislators in Washington, D.C. But like if a new state comes in, they should be allowed to vote for themselves whether or not they want to allow slavery, independent of like where they are, above or below that line, right? Now, California, by 1849, after those like 80,000 people show up in a span of like 6 months, they're applying for statehood. They're like, we want in. At this time, there are a perfect balance in Congress of states that allow slavery and states that prohibit slavery at 15. We got a map right here at the moment, when before the Mexican American War, Texas and Florida were not in the Union, and Iowa and Wisconsin were not. Before Mexican American War, it was 13, 13. That's a bad three. After the Mexican American War, Texas gets added in 1845, as does Florida. Same year, Iowa gets added. 3 years later, Wisconsin. So after this, it's 15, 15. Slave state, free state. California, though, would, no matter what happens, California is going to tip that balance. And that is going to cause especially the folks from the slave states to lose power because now free states will have an advantage, especially in the Senate, where each state has an equal number of votes. And that will sort of upset that really tenuous balance of power. And so, um, there's no reason to avoid allowing California to come in. Like they've met all the requirements. So we have to do something, but there's no other state right now that's knocking at the door that could come in as well. Remember, that's what happened in 1820 when the Compromise of 1820 happened. I'll just go back here. I'll just use this same map. In 1820, you added Missouri as a new slave state, but you also added Maine as a new free state. So it was, you know, +1 and +1. So it kept the balance. However, now California's got all these people, but none of these other areas have enough people to qualify for statehood. So it's not like there's some other state that can come in and make it 16-16 as opposed to 15-15. And so that ends up leading us to, uh, excuse me, leading us to the Compromise of 1850. And what this ends up doing is allows California in, but gives a few extra benefits to the slave states to give them something in exchange. So yeah, there's a slight balance of power in favor of free states, but it still maintains some of the benefits of having that kind of equal balance. And the things that are included in here is first is it admits California as a free state. Even though there were a small number of people that engaged in the practice of slavery, by and large, California was a state that did not engage in slavery, and so it wanted to enter the union as a free state. What it did, though, is it gave in two new territories that were carved out of here, the Utah territory and the New Mexico territory, out of that land that we got from Mexico after the Mexican American War in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, is it gave popular sovereignty in those two areas. So in Utah and New Mexico, it would allow the residents of those areas to vote for themselves whether or not they wanted to allow the practice of slavery, even though one was below that 1820 Missouri Compromise line and one was above that 1820 Missouri Compromise line. It basically kind of didn't extend that line out to these new territories that were gained from Mexico. So it allowed that practice of popular sovereignty. That was a win for the South because, like, hey, we might get some people that want to do that. Couple other areas is we bought Texas, the U.S. bought some of those Texas borderlands and finally extended Texas all the way to kind of its current level. The couple of other things were in the city of Washington, D.C., which at this time is a perfect diamond with the Potomac River running through it. What they do is they, in Washington, D.C., the nation's capital, they ban the trading of enslaved people, but not the practice of slavery itself. So you could not buy and sell slaves in Washington, D.C. any longer, but you could still own slaves in Washington, D.C. This is important because this is why Washington, D.C. is shaped the way it is today. When Washington, D.C. is first created, it is a perfect 10 by 10 diamond, with this portion here coming out of the state of Maryland, this portion here coming out of the state of Virginia. The problem is, in the Compromise of 1850, it bans that slave trade. Well, in Washington, D.C., on the southern banks of the Potomac, in what is now Arlington, Virginia, there was a very large and very profitable slave market. Actually, one of the biggest slave markets in the country at the time. And so, shortly after this Compromise of 1850, this portion of Washington, D.C., that is now Arlington and oh gosh, I can't think of it. There's like Arlington in particular, ends up what is called retroceding. They leave. And so Washington, D.C. now is kind of shaped like this. It is the stuff out of Maryland with the river running right here, but this extra area that would have made up DC is now part of Virginia because that area had that profitable slave market and they left Washington, D.C. to rejoin a state that would allow them to continue selling those enslaved persons. That is why today Washington, D.C. is this weird, you know, kind of looks like this. It should be about like that. But this part now is part of is part that's a really bad VA. But this is part of Virginia. That's why Washington D.C. looks the way it does today because of this compromise of 1850. The other thing that it included in here was the Fugitive Slave Act that was on the books at the time. That basically required anyone that found a person who had previously been held in slavery elsewhere to like report them to authorities. It required a little stronger federal enforcement. The federal government had kind of ignored that law for a while, and this was sort of a concession to those southern states. So the southern states got this like enforcement of the Slave Act. They got a little more land for Texas, and they got popular sovereignty in Utah and New Mexico, the ability of those two new territories to vote for themselves on the practice of slavery in exchange, essentially, for admitting California as a free state to the Union. So at this, before the Compromise of 1850, this is essentially what the U.S. looks like. Again, 15, 15, right? After this, We are still at 1515. California gets added as a state, so this becomes the 16th state. You divide these new territories into Utah and New Mexico, where they are open to slavery by popular sovereignty. The Oregon Territory still has a ban on slavery, and we still don't know what to do with this area in here. This area in here is what is going to be the subject of our next lesson. And honestly, this area here, especially right around here, is what is going to end up kind of kicking off the Civil War, especially in like 1856. So at this point, we've expanded from coast to coast, right? We've achieved manifest destiny. We even have a new state here on the West Coast. We're kind of dividing up these new territories. Haven't fully decided on the issue of slavery in them, but like kicking that can down the road. The problem is when a few years later, that question of slavery in especially these new territories here will end up causing a whole lot of problems that puts America very clearly on the path to civil war. And that is what we will address in our next class.